Good morning. Welcome to the design charrette for restoring the Los Angeles River and tributaries through the Sepulveda Basin. This first 5 or 10 minutes is a re-record because we had a small technical glitch in the original, but everything will be the same as close as possible to what actually happened on the day. So thank you. We want to begin by acknowledging that the Sepulveda Basin is peripheral to the historic site of the indigenous village of Siutkanga and located on unceded territory of the Fernandeño Tataviam, Tongva, Kij, and Chumash peoples. We are excited to be here with the experts that make up the Sepulveda Basin Wildlife Area Steering Committee. As some of you know, this is a project that we've been working on advancing for more than 20 years. And we're grateful to the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy for supporting this critical first step in realizing our collective vision. So here's how our session is going to proceed today. I'm going to introduce the team. We'll talk about why we're here and what we want to accomplish together. We're going to review the underlying site conditions before taking our first break. When we come back, we'll dive into more detail on the hydrology and geomorphic processes that will drive our design process before breaking into 3 groups for the interactive design charrette. Then we'll take another break before coming back together to share your design ideas with the whole group. For now, we ask that everybody stay on mute and use the chat feature if questions come up as we move through the presentation. We'll do our best to keep track of them so we can get to everything in the Q&A. So I'm going to start by introducing the project team. I'm Melanie Winter. I'm representing the River Project, and we are the project lead. Our engineering firm is Balance Hydrologics, and they'll be doing our hydrology, hydraulics, and geomorphology analysis. They're represented here today by Ann Center, Scott Brown, and Anna Nazaroff. We have GHD doing the landscape architecture work. They do habitat analysis, habitat restoration and design, also urban design and circulation. They're represented here today by Jessica Hall, who I'm sure many of you know, as well as Jonathan Linkus. And lastly, SALT LA, also supporting work as a landscape architecture firm during this design charrette and doing stakeholder engagement support. And they're represented here today by Claire Bowen, who some of you also may know. So our purpose is to restore the Los Angeles River and its tributaries through the Sepulveda Basin. Our overall project goals are to create a healthy Los Angeles River ecosystem within the Sepulveda Basin by removing artificial channel constraints, enabling geomorphic processes, enhancing native species riparian corridor, and establishing a functional floodplain that transitions to biodiverse upland habitats. We really want geomorphic processes to drive the design. So it's really useful to have some fluvial geomorphologists on our team. Specific goals: improving river riparian corridor floodplain functionality. We can accomplish this by removing existing concrete in the channel, expanding channel widths, expanding floodplain areas, and establishing native vegetation, understory, and tree species. Improving the boating experience on the Los Angeles River. So as many of you know, the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy has a river recreation zone here in the basin, but they have been limited in the areas of the river that they can easily use because of the drop structures. So if we, through this process, can remove the grade control structures and restore some sinuosity to the river channel while maintaining 3-foot depth and a 25-foot width for ideal boating conditions, this is one of the goals that we have here. And we also want to establish a boat launch and takeout, storage, restroom access, and the parking and public transportation connectivity for the recreation zone. We want to increase stormwater storage behind the dam. That will mean removing fill. And that can be accomplished by reestablishing geomorphic river floodplains, We want to identify space within the leased areas for increased flood frequency and habitat related to riverine flood functions. Basically, it's just we're looking for places that we can maintain uses while removing some fill, so we can increase the total volumetric storage capacity behind the dam. As many of you are aware, we're going to have longer periods of drought, and when we get rain, we'll get likely much more intense rainfall. So increasing storage capacity behind the dam not only protects surrounding communities, but can also facilitate our last goal, which is increasing groundwater recharge. We want to see if we can facilitate some incidental recharge here. Because of the basin's location and soil, it's not something that we would do an engineered spreading ground approach here, but we do know that incidental recharge happens at the basin, and that happens the longer stormwater can be detained on site, the more stormwater you're going to see infiltrating to groundwater. So by slowing the flood velocities and spreading the flood waters out over a larger area in the basin during storms, the more stormwater we can get infiltrated to groundwater. Currently, it's designed so that the water moves out, no matter how large the flood, the water moves out of the basin very quickly, just like all of Los Angeles is designed to move rain out of here as fast as possible. So those are our goals. And I want to do a little reflection before we move on to diving into the details. Just to ground us a bit before we review the site conditions. As most of you know, Sepulveda Basin Wildlife Area Steering Committee has been meeting regularly and religiously for over 30 years. Their mission is to oversee, in its advisory capacity, the wildlife refuge areas and other areas of present or potential natural value within the Sepulveda Basin, as well as to support policies and programs that ensure their long-term preservation, protection, and enhancement. The committee's dedication and expertise here is unparalleled. I think it's unparalleled anywhere in the city of Los Angeles for a committee. But we're eager to benefit from your guidance in this study. And I want to share this little bit of a letter from an early committee member, Sandy Wolgemuth. This was written in 1993 on Audubon letterhead. And I thought it would help remind us of how long we have all been holding this vision. The essential character of Sepulveda must be preserved through all the changes. The opportunity to have an unstructured outdoor experience, to walk, to jog, to fly a kite, to read a book. It's also a place to enhance the native plants and increase the diversity of creatures in the present wildlife reserve. We look forward to the possibility to expand wildlife habitat to other suitable areas throughout the basin, Sod Farm, for example, or the 40-acre cornfield east of the GLT baseball fields. We would like to see the tributaries of the Los Angeles River, Woodley and Havenhurst channels, Encino and Bull Creeks, developed as thriving riparian courses. Bull Creek is historically a genuine wildlife corridor, offering in spring and fall a splendid avenue for migrating songbirds. Dale Pierce, biologist with the Army Corps and later with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, said in 1981 that despite the trash and litter, quote, "This creek has considerable resource value and should be preserved and enhanced," unquote. If we do the right thing, we can have it all. And I thought that's just a lovely, lovely letter from Sandy. And now we're going to move on to site conditions. So here's, overall aerial view, site conditions to begin. I want to recognize that, there are numerous efforts planned and underway right now in the basin. CNPS and FOLAR have been engaging volunteers in invasive species removal and biomonitoring. The committee is looking at employing goats to manage invasive species moving forward. There's a post-fire recovery team looking at how to restore native species throughout the burn areas. There are efforts to identify ways to improve pathways and access throughout the wildlife area. There's the 2028 Olympics, the Army Corps Master Plan update soon to be released, and Councilmember Martinez's motion to develop a new master plan together with Rec and Parks. So we hope to hear from all of you involved in these efforts, how our work here can support, enhance, and hopefully integrate these endeavors. So our study's focus is the river and its tributaries. And these assets could become a key focal feature of Sepulveda Basin in the future, rather than the secret hidden kind of treasures that they currently are. Not all visitors to the basin are even aware that the river, much less the tributaries, flow through the basin. So today, the waterways in the basin have 5 different conditions. We do have this one nice stretch of the main stem that has the soft bottom and interesting a soft bottom and no levees, no engineered levees on the banks, which is pretty great. And but others have soft bottoms and varying kinds of engineered levees on the side. The tributaries are the same. They're all very different as they flow through the basin. I'm sure most of you have experienced them one way or another. So we're just going to do a quick little tour. This is, within basin territory, but not really thought of as part of the recreation area, upstream of the busway bridge, fully channelized with low flow. Yep. Now this is just immediately downstream of the bus bridge when the soft bottom starts. Of course, it always captures all the sediment and the trash and our wonderful indicator species of shopping carts. This is just a little bit downstream where you see that sort of grouted riprap slapdash levee there. And then downstream here, you can see the bottom left photograph. You can see that sheet pile wall of drop structure that creates some nice, motion in the river, but it also creates blockages for a lot of different things, fish, kayaks. Next. There's fishing, of course. You can see here the floodplain is sort of functioning as it moves out and flows across horizontally. And then you also have a bit further downstream, we've seen a lot of erosion happening here in this particular location here by the airfield. And that has been, this is shot from a few years ago, it has been increasing pretty significantly over the years. And here you see evidence of that. You really got a sheer stress. You can see in that photo on the right that the fence that used to be there, the fence post has fallen down the wall as well. You do have the benefit when you have the sinuosity here. If you look to the left at the lovely sandbar with the habitat there, but this sort of erosion is something we really want to take a look at in restoring better fluvial function here. Next. And then, of course, moving under Burbank Boulevard Bridge towards the dam. And that's looking back from the dam. The levees are channelized again there, but we do have some really nice habitat established. Bull Creek, a couple of different conditions here. Do you know this was created with an oxbow feature about a decade or so back. The oxbow isn't wetted very often. It's a bit, the channels are a bit narrow, but it is lovely. Go ahead. Havenhurst Creek, this is looking at from Victory as it begins to enter the basin, and then further downstream you can see the character, very, very overgrown. Next. Woodley Creek, again, you see a different levee treatment there with the rock treatment, and it is pretty. Oops, waiting room person. Barbara. Overgrown in other places. Sorry. Next. Encino Creek, again, a completely different sort of treatment on the levees there, and again, you see some invasive species, lots of palm, castor bean. Next. Haskell Creek, which is really nice. And you see here the post-fire shot of Haskell Creek there, and you've seen some woody debris coming across the river, which is lovely and creates some good function. Next. And then, of course, the wildlife areas which have seen, and other areas of the basin which have seen encampments of late, which are causing issues. Next. And then the North Wildlife Area. And we have that wonderful monument that reminds us what actually happens in the basin when it rains. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now. And we're going to move on to looking at the geomorphic processes. Anna?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. So as part of the project team, I'm in charge of running the hydraulic model for the basin. So I'm going to show you some interesting results that we saw from that. But yeah, I do want to talk about this monument just for a quick second. So 2-year flood, right? That's something that has a probability of happening, a 50% chance of happening every year. A 20-year has a 5% chance, and a 50-year has a 2% chance. And of course, you know, with climate change and with years of drought, those probabilities are going to become greater and greater, right? So, you know, what used to be a 20-year event in the past might happen more often. And, you know, we could look at places like Houston that in the last, like 5 years has had 3 100-year events and 1 500-year event, right? So, you know, looking at the sign, and we'll look at the hydraulic model and what these elevations look like. But if you assume that, or estimate that the sign is about 5 feet tall.
Nope.
Can everybody make sure that they're muted?
Muted. We have the power to mute, Melanie.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about that.
It's okay. Yeah, so if you know, if we're standing at this monument and we're watching a 2-year flood come up, it's going to be right about at our feet. If you assume it's a 5 foot tall sign at a 20-year event, we're swimming in 15 feet of water, and then in a 50-year flood, we've got 20 feet of water around here. Next slide, please. Before we can talk about and think about what water does inside of the basin, we should talk about how it actually gets there first. So this is a huge area that drains to this basin, right? So the main stem of the LA River here drains 160 square miles just on its own. And then the remaining 50 to 60 square miles comes from the smaller tributaries. And as we are all very aware, and was mentioned in the introductions, this is a highly, highly urbanized area, right? So when it rains, it's not like we have this slow watershed response getting to the basin. Things happen really, really quickly. So the peak event on record happened in February 16th, 1980, and the meaty part of the storm, where the peak flow came in and out of the this is not it, but similarly, where the peak came out in and out of the basin, took about 6 hours for the maximum peak to drain all of those watersheds. So things happen very quickly. And I'm gonna switch over to my screen here so we can look a little bit about what water does once it's actually inside of the basin. Okay, so, you know, later on today, we're going to head into our brainstorming sessions, and when we start thinking about how we might want to, what kind of restoration features we might want to see in the basin, and knowing a little bit about how the basin fills up and how it's designed to function right now, I think could help inform some of those restoration decisions. So I'm going to scroll through And this is like a maximum event, kind of looking to see how does the basin fill up to its maximum storage elevation. Okay. And what I want us to notice on this first time through is that the basin is kind of like a swimming pool with a deep end, with the deep end being down by the dam. And so it's not going to fill uniformly. It's going to fill down at the dam first and then back up to fill the rest of it. So here's what that looks like. We've got all of the tributaries coming in, the main stem coming in, and then it starts filling up at the bottom. And fills up from there. The red elevations, or sorry, depths, this is showing depth, are 30 feet and greater. So you can see, you know, down at the dam, we've got really high depths and then maybe slightly lower once we get out into the flood. One, and let's look at this, focusing on something else. So that time we focused on how the basin fills up from bottom to the top. And this time I want you to focus on where the breakouts happen and how the water leaves the main channel, because that's going to help, that's going to tell us what the water naturally wants to do and maybe could help inform some of our restoration ideas from there. So again, we start the storm, it's going to fill up that bottom portion first. I'm going to pause here and point out that it's starting to break out onto the golf course here. Breaking out. And then we actually see another breakout kind of at the top, and you'll see the two connect on the golf course here. And what you'll start to notice too on the golf course is there are these deeper kind of remnant channels, right? So these could be places where when the river used to be able to move, these could be places where it had flowed in the past. Okay, so one last time, and this time we're just gonna pause in places and look at a static storage volume. So thinking back to that monument again, right? The monument is located on this little point in the lake over here. So water, a 2-year event, like the monument said, was water at your feet, right? So we that's somewhere around here, right? Water is at your feet. And what I want you to start to notice is that coincidentally, this is about when Burbank Boulevard starts to flood, and you know, that checks out. There's a lot of closing of that boulevard when there are, excuse me, these kind of regular storm events. The 20-year event was when you were swimming in 15 feet of water over at the sign. So that looks like something like this. Okay, so we can see, you know, 15 feet of water here means that we've got 1 to 4 feet of water up at the upstream end where the blue colors are. Maximum event on record was that February 16th, 1980. That looked something like this. And then we have that 50-year event, which is, you know, 2% chance of occurring every year, but likely increasing. It's going to look something like this. And then the maximum storage before the spillway gets engaged looks something like this. All right, so that's all for my hydraulic modeling. Stop the share, and Jessica, you can have the presentation back.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat and wildlife at the basin. I do this with some trepidation, knowing that probably 80% of the people in this Zoom space know far more about it than I do and know it more intimately. And so I'm basically going to be like the kindergartner telling you what I learned about the Sepulveda Basin by comparison. As you all know, there are a number of really important Southern California habitats within the basin. They have been, some of them created by members of this very wildlife committee who have gone out and worked this land and planted it and done amazing things to bring various communities to, vegetative communities to the basin. And so just want to acknowledge that. The river itself has a cottonwood forest alliance of species. It includes willows, box elder, and as well as the cottonwood. And some of the tributary streams, a lot of, invasive species are a huge part of these systems as well. But you see some willow and other species coming up and down the tributaries as well. We have the needlegrass, purple needlegrass lands. We have the coyote willow or sandbar willow. We have mealfat, and the mealfat seems to be really important. I'm going to talk about later. Coast live oak woodlands. We have buckwheat and the coyote brush itself. And then we have a range of ornamental landscapes, lawns, as well as ruderal landscapes and agricultural uses. So I know that, like I said, you guys know this way better than I do. I wanted to understand more about the interrelationship between some of these habitat areas and bird species in particular. I chose birds because I understand that there's, I think just in general, a lot more observation of the bird species at the basin, and that gives us some indicator of the richness that the basin can provide to biodiversity. So I went to eBird. I also looked at the Wildlife Steering Committee page, webpage, and a few other sources, some documents by the Army Corps, did a general review of documents. But I found eBird to be a very convenient and easy way of capturing a very gestural understanding of what's out there. And so, people have published their bird lists. You have great citizen science. So these circles in yellow represent kind of core areas of birding. And the size of the circles represent something about the sort of number of sightings that have been recorded for those areas. Overall, you have more than 280 species of birds that have been identified at the basin. And they tend to, the size of these circles sort of speaks to the type of birds and the relative frequency of sightings of them. So not surprisingly, pigeon-like birds have been seen a lot more than other birds, but a lot of waterfowl, waders are also very commonly seen. And then you get to less frequently observed birds or reported birds further down the list. There are also species of concern, listed species, as well as California species of concern. And from what I saw, the birds that are in this circle have been observed in different parts of the basin. Some of them are specialists, that you would see, especially around the mealfat scrub or emergent willow. Some of them are perchers who really like the dense woodlands. Some of them like the grasslands. And so from that perspective, it's really important that as we think about how the river changes the landscape of the basin, that we also think about the existing habitats that have established there and how we continue to maintain the acreages of those habitats, or how we can find ways to expand them and make them part of the landscaping of the rest of the facilities that are at the basin. So that was kind of my takeaway for the purposes of our charrette, is to keep that in mind as we're moving into thinking about how do we move the river through this landscape, and how does that affect everything around it, and how do we then massage everything around it to make sure that we don't end up with any loss, but we end up with a net gain from a wildlife biodiversity standpoint. And of course, I should give a nod to the arroyo chub, the red-legged frog, and our friend, the southwestern pond turtle, who are also part of this and are affiliated and associated mostly with, of course, the aquatic interface with the basin. Wildfire is an issue here at the basin, as all of you also know very, very, very well. And there are a number of things that impact the occurrence of wildfire, amongst them homeless encampments, invasive species management practices, and of course, climate change. There's probably other factors as well. We just want to acknowledge that this is a process that is occurring at the basin. It's likely that it will continue to some degree as we move into the future. And some of our questions are to think about how we should manage this and what we can do to reduce the frequency and the intensity of these events. Now to sort of talk about the human sort of uses of the basin. There are quite a lot of facilities at the basin itself. And I'm not going to list them all, but we know that there's active recreation, there's passive recreation, there are actual facilities for our wastewater treatment, there's military installations and activities here. And so there's a lot going on at the basin. And the way that they are parceled out or spaced into the basin, it doesn't appear to have developed out of a kind of master plan vision of the integration of access and use and spatial relationships of things. It seems kind of like a patchwork approach where somebody carved out this space because they wanted to do this thing, and then they did the same thing over there. And so it's a little bit spread out in ways that I think is also something we can play with as we think about charretting around the river, because the river forces us to think about how the spaces work together. And this is a diagram that we developed because we're thinking about, this is, again, I just want to say, this is about the human asset management side of things, as opposed to the river and natural biodiversity side of things. So there are these sort of core areas that are under someone's lease, under someone's management. And we wanted to imagine what they're thinking about in terms of how often they want to see their facilities flooded, or how, maybe not what to see, but how often they might be expecting their facilities to be flooded. And so we created this kind of way of diagramming, and I'm sorry for my cat, she apparently really wants to be part of this meeting. In climate change and risk management, there are this different approaches, thinking about defend, adapt, retreat. You hear that in climate change. So we wanted to think of this in terms of defend, adapt, restore. And defending is, of course, those spaces where somebody wants to limit or have no flooding. And so you can see under where Tillman is located, we made that a dark brown. We imagine that they probably, City of LA, does not want Tillman to flood. And I think we all know that to be true. In the green are areas where there could be occasional or moderate flooding, that it's reasonable to expect that that would be happening. And as we all saw from the flood model, it definitely happens. And in the blue areas, this is kind of a little more nuanced. So it's not just that it floods, but or potentially floods, but that there are ecological processes that are being given space to occur. So I don't want to, you know, and so we have habitats in those areas that are not floodplain habitats per se, but they're there and they are performing ecosystem services. And so want to think of the blue areas in that context. And so we did this exercise to try to understand kind of the fungibility of these spaces from that standpoint. And another thing to look at is destinations from the perspective of users. And we don't have good data at this time for who's using the basin and how many people are going and what they're going there for. But based on just the sheer numbers of ball fields, for example, we have a reasonable expectation that there's probably a lot of sports users at the basin. We recognize that people are using, for example, the wildlife area for a variety of reasons, including educational ones. So there are more users there than probably I'm thinking of. But when we create space for biodiversity, the density of humans usually gets reduced. And so there's a smaller circle there for that. So that would be something to consider. And yes, the cricket fields should be labeled. I apologize for missing that. And this is a circulation network diagram. We're looking at roads and trails. And in general, you know, they encircle the basin. I did do a quick check on the mileage of trails in the facility, and I wasn't terribly picky about what they were. It included sidewalks, it included dirt tracks, but it came to about 28 miles, just a little bit under. So and that's a footpaths, things that, you know, but multi-use bikes, trails, for example. However, you know, there are large parcels of land that these trails don't necessarily go into because, for example, a golf course tends to be managed as a discrete island that can only be accessed from one point, which is the point of entry into the golf course. And so the ability to circulate throughout the entire basin is somewhat constrained in that regard. And then we have a little bit of a wild card in terms of our charretting today. As we're thinking about how we might move around some of the water courses to give them back their meanders, to make them more functional, reconnecting them to their floodplains, there's a large part of the basin that is also likely to be altered and occupied, at least temporarily, for the 2028 Olympics. This is a graphic that has been publicly disseminated that describes some of the facilities that they are considering to place at the Sepulveda Basin. I've labeled them so you can see there's a shotgun range, a rifle and pistol range, there's an archery area, a pentathlon, kayak and canoe whitewater slalom that is directly above north of Lake Balboa, and an equestrian cross-country facility taking over Woodley Golf Course. The canoe and kayak whitewater slalom is described as something that would be built to be permanent and then handed over as a lease and sort of, you know, activity for a for-profit entity to manage. So there are some, you know, spatial implications of this that we have to consider as we go about the design process. It also is interesting from the standpoint that it kind of shows us that where there's the political will and the financing, things can change at the basin. And assuming that this goes forward, which by all appearances, it seems that this is something that will be happening. So from the standpoint of our design group today, we're all a design group today, I would invite everyone to think about this as an opportunity to change things around. I would also invite you, if you want to play with this, to think about this as, how would I make a restored river system and restored tributaries work with, for example, an equestrian cross-country course? Whether or not you want an equestrian cross-country course there, it's an opportunity to think about those things. So it's a little challenging, but it also, I think, provides some food for thought. We're going to stop for now, and I'm going to hand it back to Melanie to review any questions and comments that have come through in the chat. And we'll be having an opportunity for a few minutes to just go into that a little bit more in depth if there's anything anybody wants to dig into a little bit more.
Thanks, Jessica. I've not a lot of really specific questions in the chat, except, you know, will we be able to see the presentation and the recording in the future? Will that be made public? That seems to be a super popular question here. Mark commented that the really nice habitat in those tributaries is removed annually by the Corps to allow outflow through the dam during high water. Or maybe you meant at the just above the dam. That really nice habitat is removed annually to allow outflow through the dam during high water. And I will just note that that may be due to an occurrence that had happened, and we've seen video of it recorded by the Corps during an earlier storm, where some debris clogged up the dam gates, and there was considerable concern about that. Clark had a question about the frequency of various inundation levels. And I think we can speak to that. Anna can speak to that, but I think she did a bit. One of the interesting things about flood frequency is we're used to talking about it in terms of probability, 1-year storm, a 10-year storm, a 100-year storm. But with what we understand about climate change, the folks who work in that space have a phrase now that says stationarity, which is the frequency interval. Stationarity is dead. So it's kind of moot these days. Houston has had several 100-year events in the last 5 years, for instance, as have other places around the world. So that sort of probability calculation is not as relevant as it once was. But I think Anna could speak to, how often those various levels have been hit, if you want to, Anna.
Sure. Yeah. We don't have a lot of information actually about past large events. The 1980 event that I was talking about, that's the only time that's ever the basin's been filled to that capacity. I think the kind of those lower levels where Burbank Boulevard starts to flood and they have to close that road, that happens, at least, I think at this point, at least once per rainy season, but, for sure, at least once every 2 years. Let's see, historic pattern of inundation would be helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, that we don't, the Army Corps shared with us the peak event, but they did not share with us some of the smaller events. So I'm not sure how well I can speak to that. And then Mark O says, an issue for the Army Corps is that the volume of vegetation reduces the flood control capacity of the basin. It's true.
Yeah, and that's something that they always talk about, the balance. If you're going to add something to the basin, be it a structure or more vegetation, they want to make sure that you're removing something from the basin so that it can maintain its control capacity, its detention capacity. Let's see, another question. Marianne commented that she's very worried about the whitewater slalom thing for the Olympics. I will note that the things that seem to be potentially permanent would be the whitewater slalom facility and the public swimming pools that are part of the pentathlon over closer to Balboa. But all of this is theoretical at this point in time. This is what we've seen. The publicly released documents are from their bid book, and I expect a lot of that is subject to change. We do know that if they do proceed with hosting these particular events in the basin, that there will be a lot of land use change and a lot of construction going on for between a year and a half for a lot of the facilities, but 3 years, I think, for the whitewater construction, and a lot of financial investment as well. Glenn is noting that it appears that one of the Olympic venues might impact the natural buffer area of the LA River. That would appear to be correct. But again, just note that these, I think, are their bid book. These aren't construction documents. So it's great that we're all able to look at how this is, we have a lot of efforts from this committee to the council members' proposed motion to make sure that we have a more integrated master planning process moving forward.
Melanie, I noticed there was one other question about whether the whitewater slalom course is the same as Bull Creek. I just wanted to mention that that would be a separate facility. It has to be pretty pretty standardized. So it would be separate. Bull Creek, I mean, there's still actually kind of that area in green. Presumably Bull Creek would remain in that area.
Yeah, and I've just pointed my arrow to where we have Bull
Yep.
Creek. The 4 is my label, so that is not on top, meant to me, interpreted as on top of Bull Creek, but the developed area to the left of it.
It's pretty tight, but there's questions about the bidder financing restoration due to its impacts. But I guess that's to be seen. There's also the option of just having a real lovely integrated plan, where, as opposed to legal back and forths on things, that we're really creating a situation for the basin that enhances ecosystem function as well as can host an Olympics. Marianne was trying to imagine what would happen to the whitewater pool features during a major flood, which is an excellent thought. Joe is thinking about what happens to the extension of the bike path. Great thing to think about as we're going into design. I do want to note that as we go into design, all these things keep in mind, and I'll also keep in mind that as we look at that Olympics graphic, you can see that with political will and funding, all existing land uses appear to be fungible. So, whatever exists in the basin, for instance, if there need to be changes to the bike path, there may need to be changes to the bike path, and we have the opportunity to consider that here today. Don't put constraints on your thinking here. Let's see. Glenn, there's a concern that the council member is an attempt to facilitate the Olympic facilities. That I think I've heard that expressed from the Wildlife Area Steering Committee. And I think the steering committee is a pretty powerful force. And I think that all of us together, I'm sure that including the council member, we all want to see the best outcome for the basin. And her motion does mention Ellie River restoration and master planning. So we're really happy to have the opportunity to be at the table working with you all at this point in time.
Melanie, can I interject something?
Please.
I don't recall if this was answered, but there have been some comments in the chat bar about whether or not this is being videoed and whether or not information will be made available for review later.
Yeah, that was the first thing I brought up.
Okay.
Yes, we are recording it. I didn't start mine until a little bit late, but I'm pretty sure that Scott started his at the very beginning, so we're good. And we, of course, are going to be having a full deliverable for the Conservancy on this. So there will be this and more for you to have access to as we move forward. Hope that helps. And thank you for the kind words about the quality of the presentation. I appreciate that. I think the team does. See, Teresa has seen coyote in the slalom area north of the lake. Does that have wildlife habitat, and will there be a CEQA review? I assume there'll be a NEPA review for the Olympics facility because it is federal property, but I guess that all remains to be seen. And then Patricia is concerned about underutilized space. Yes, underutilized space is something people who work on the river are used to seeing all the time. Or any of us who work in conservation are used to seeing all the time. And we just have to let it roll off our backs and talk about how other critters can use it. And that can benefit all of us, I think. All right, do we have any other questions before we all take a fluid leveling break before we come back and dive into the next section? If anybody has anything pressing, let's see. Glenn, we should be concerned about findings of no significant impact or mitigated negative declarations being used to build the Olympic facilities. Yes. This is ever the case.
I think that is true. One of the approaches of this Olympics is to build very little. Their whole kind of method in terms of trying to be a sustainable Olympics is using existing facilities. So it will be a very low construction Olympics by comparison to other Olympics.
Yeah, I think that would be expected. Since we've already hosted an Olympics and we have a lot of facilities. The basin does seem to be a little bit of an exception to that, but you know, we all have the opportunity to help guide.
Look,
Oops. We all have the opportunity to help guide.
yeah, I'd be interested to see what the basin plans are.
We did understand that some of the facilities that were described were potentially temporary in their nature.
Yeah. But we do need to be vigilant, and I think this committee has a terrific history of being just that. So, all right, let's take a fluid leveling break, do some stretches. We'll be back in, let's see, it's 11:13. We'll be back at 11:20. How's that? Sound good?
Great, thank you.
All right, everybody, see you soon. All right, everybody, are we hoping we're all back? It's 11:21. And if you get a second, we have a little more to take a look at before we break into Charrette. But in the meanwhile, so that everybody knows what everybody's affiliation is when we do break into Charrette, if you know how to do it, would you mind going to your Zoom name? And that's by going to your the little dots up there in where your photo would be, and clicking on that. There you go. I'm seeing some folks do this, and then saying change name, and that means you can just edit it and add after your name. You could add your affiliation. That would be super great for those who don't know each other as we move into the Charrette phase a little bit. All right, I'm gonna hand it over to Jessica to keep moving us forward.
And I'm going to hand it over to Ann Center.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
we're going to get started. It's all right.
Yeah.
No worries. We're going to start by thinking about the river itself and the functions that shape it.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm excited to be here. And just generally speaking, it's exciting to have this opportunity to think about restoration and rehabilitation of the Los Angeles River and its tributaries within the Sepulveda Basin. As we've been saying, our goal is that geomorphic processes will drive restoration design toward enhancement of functional and healthy habitat for the streams and the aquatic and terrestrial creatures that depend on them. So let's start to think about what river corridor elements exist today and how might conditions change as the community thinks about restoration elements in the Charrette today. So the depiction on the left, in the upper left corner here, is the existing condition geomorphic form, which shows that the river is currently dynamic within its boundaries. You can see some wiggles, but mostly straight, and we know it's deeply channelized, which is meant to keep the flows confined for the most part. The North Bank Grand Canyon erosion area suggests that under existing hydrology, mostly the flooding conditions, but the river is developing meanders, slash sinuosity. So it is wiggling on its own, and it wants to widen. At least it wants to widen the corridor. The image on the right depicts a restoration possibility where the channel varies in width and has a lot more wiggliness. I saw some discussion about, what does sinuosity mean? And everybody who chimed in, I loved the think of a snake as a way to think about it. And so, it's wiggliness as well. And so in this restoration possibility, the channel varies in width, it has more wiggliness, the riparian corridor is generally wider, and the floodplain is much wider than the active channel. So there's a variety of approaches that are possible within this general framework. Next slide, please. For instance, if a single threaded channel is the primary active channel form, higher flows would rise above the channel banks and then spread out onto the floodplain. Jessica is going to explain the process on the left while I talk a little bit about the processes on the right. So Jessica, you're up.
Thank you. So to me, geomorphology is the basis of design that everything else stacks on top of. When water is shaping the land around a river system, you have the habitats that evolve and develop based on its relationship to that flood cycle and the amount of water that's saturated in the soils. And you have that prism of species as you go further and higher away from the water source itself. So to me, that's how you create the most resilient ecosystem, is to allow that natural process to drive the distribution of habitats. And so what you see in this depiction is where there's regular flooding, of course, there's more like aquatic species, or there are very few habitat species. Very few plant species. And then as you get out of that into the overbank zone where there's frequent flooding, you have different levels of classes of willow and cottonwood developing. The ones that are right on the margins of the banks are going to be flooded more frequently. They're going to be smaller just by virtue of the type of flooding that they're subjected to. And as you go further away from the river, you're going to see more established mature forests that have been allowed to grow to their old age because the floods aren't knocking them down as frequently. And then you go further and higher up and you have drier and drier species and habitats. So I think that when we're designing, we should be thinking about how that transition, those slopes, those banks, the terraces, all those pieces of the river corridor work together to create the mosaic of habitats that we want to see enhanced, increased, and made more rich at the basin. Similarly, there are appropriate uses for us as human beings in how we access these areas based on this flood regime and how it shapes the landscapes. And so, obviously boating is something you would see where the water is. There may also be people walking and getting their feet in the water, things like that. As you move further out, you can have trails, you can have floodable parks, the Gulf can be floodable, agriculture, all appropriate uses, all historically found in floodplains. And as you go further out, then you might talk about integrating some infrastructure. But we want to be really clear about the importance of respecting the flood frequencies in relationship to land uses.
So, another channel type would be a multi-threaded channel system that would be somewhat wider with secondary channels on the floodplain that are activated as flow increases. This would result in concentrated areas where most floodwaters would get routed, at least in the lower or in the higher frequency, like the 2-year event, and depending on size of the flood.
And in this scenario, where I was describing earlier how the geomorphology drives the landscape, the design of the landscape, what you see here is that because these channels get activated on the floodplains, they create opportunities for different kinds of habitat to establish at higher elevations. And so you might be likely to see more of that mule fat scrub or some other kinds of things that would just evolve naturally in those places because of that. And with that, again, comes the opportunity for different user experiences and uses alongside that.
And then there's a braided channel type, which would be even wider with a corridor where many channels are present or possible or actively evolving, where the creek or river moves from side to side very easily. And most flooding then would stay within a braided channel corridor, again, depending on the size of the flood.
And again, so from the habitat standpoint, this again opens up more opportunities for that alluvial scrub communities. Things like the Leasebells vireo would probably have more area to establish and thrive in this kind of condition.
So it's important to note that the hydrology of the river is much different than under historical conditions. The aim of our restoration process is to accommodate the existing hydrology, which includes Tillman Reclamation Plant discharges of approximately 30 CFS all the time. And that's shown here in the left-hand image, which we can consider kind of a base flow. And base flow is defined as flow that happens most of the time, under fairly dry conditions. Clearly, it's not a natural condition, but it is the existing hydrology. And so as Anna indicated in the existing conditions modeling results, the nature of the basin is to provide downstream flood control. Flooding depends on the magnitude of rainfall and whether it's rained a lot in prior weeks and whether upstream soils may already be full of moisture, and to a large degree because of urbanization. This makes flows, whether it's a moderate rainfall or a heavy rainfall, pretty flashy or quick coming into the basin, and also tapering off pretty quickly as well. So it's a much different than what a fully natural system would be. The basin is designed to empty quickly as well, again, depending on the size of the storm. And so we do have to keep in mind that floods will affect facilities within the flooding footprint.
I'm going to jump in and just note that that image on the right
Yes.
was taken at about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning after the 2005 storm, which was pretty massive, and it had rained up until about dawn. So that basin had been quite full, and then the basin opened up again very quickly, and there you can see the sedimentation, but that gives you an idea of just how quickly it goes from being full to being drained.
Another point about flow conditions is that there's a USGS gauge station downstream of the dam, but what it gauges is what comes out of the dam gates. So there's no gauge data about what flow comes into the basin from the river or from any of the tributaries. So this is definitely a data gap that will need to be addressed in future project phases. And it's one of the reasons why Anna, talked pretty generally about, like what, recurrence interval we see with the floods in the basin, because we don't really have that information. Okay, next. So kind of bringing these geomorphic pieces together, the Santa Clara River is a pretty good example of the various channel types that we discussed being driven by geomorphic form and hydrology. This section of the river here at Santa Paula is about 3 miles long, which is pretty much the same length as the LA River within the Sepulveda Basin. So you can see that the channel varies in width, in sinuosity, floodplain width varies, the amount of riparian vegetation varies. Next slide, please. And so this is just a close-up of a portion of the previous slide. So though the Santa Clara River has a different sediment load and is a more open and natural system, it does give us a decent idea of locally what exists. And I think that's what I have to say about that one. I believe the next slide is for Scott to start talking about storage potential.
Sure. What we just wanted to highlight here, one of the stated goals is to, potentially increase the capacity of the basin. And these next couple of slides kind of illustrate, what that effect might be. We're looking kind of an oblique photo downstream toward the dam, and then right at the bottom of the photo, you can see the profile, kind of an approximation of the land surface profile that we're cut into there. You can see the channel called out right there in the middle. And the area shaded in red would be basically kind of outlining, the current channel profile. And then, the extent to which we can lower the floodplain and or widen the channel corridor, that provides additional detention storage within that area. So that would be represented by that yellow portion just to the right of the channel there. The existing full capacity of the basin is just under 22,000 acre feet. So, just to give an example, if you increase that by 1%, that's an additional 219 acre feet, 2%, 438, and so on. I'll go ahead and switch to the next slide. Now, if you translate that to what kind of area, obviously, you can spread that additional volume out over a large area, or you can concentrate it in a smaller area, resulting in deeper excavation. So the bottom table there kind of basically says if you're looking to increase the potential storage by 1%, and you do that over an acre or over an area of about 110 acres, you would have to remove an average of 2 feet from the floodplain area. Similarly, if you want to get 10%, and you can do it over, and you can only do it over 270 or so acres, you'd have to remove 8 feet of soil depth. So you get an idea of what the range might be for the change in depth. So it kind of called out an area, and I'll just say these are strictly examples. They're not tied to any sort of plans that we have, but just an example. Here's a 25 acre area. If you could carve out an 8 feet of depth, then you'd get somewhere around 1% increase just for that that area that's highlighted in red at the just to the right of the channel there. So that gives a sense for the scale. Then you go to the next slide. This is kind of looking at it in a little bit closer. This would be the existing channel profile with relatively almost looking like a levee off on the right. And there's some area within that channel. We've got some vegetation, the trees growing on the benches. And if you go to the next slide, the extent to which you can, the areas highlighted in peach would be, potential areas to remove, to kind of widen that to allow this area to flood more frequently, or to allow the flood to spread out more frequently and activate those areas. Then the area shaded would essentially be your increase in volume there. And then I think the last photo then this would be kind of the restore channel profile, where you have a wider area. It's more gently sloping toward the river. You don't have those kind of steep, almost levee-like areas. And so these areas, it would be basically a wider area that would be inundated on a more frequent basis, allowing for higher detention volume. And the last thing I'll say is, we've kind of cached this as the % increase in storage for the maximum, relative to the maximum storage. In this scenario, you would actually have quite a high increase in storage for a smaller event. You basically, to the extent that area is immediately adjacent to the river. So, your percentage increases as the event, % increases as the events get smaller and more frequent. So you can move on from there, and I will pass it back to Jessica.
All right, so we showed this graphic earlier when we were talking about the basin from the standpoint of kind of the uses and leases that are in the basin and the relative floodability and what that means. I'm going to tag team with Jonathan Linkus on these slides, but really want to sort of play with the idea of how to approach the design charrette with in mind the fact that we do have these leases, and there are some levels of expectations about how floodable some of them might be. And I'll just start by noting, so one approach that could be taken from the design charrette perspective is to think about the tributaries and the river as an interlaced network of watercourses that are woven through the landscape. That creates a floodable zones that the water is flowing through on a pretty regular basis throughout different uses and leaseholder groups. Obviously, this would be a sensitive conversation with those groups. We are doing this charrette with the open mind about what is going to be the best approach for river function and for habitat, and recognize that at some point has to be reconciled with all of the stakeholder interests that we have in the basin. Another approach would be to look at those watercourses as where they are and think of a kind of widened flood zone around them, and how you would then incorporate that higher level of flooding and ecological services within that flood zone. So there's a couple of approaches. I'm going to ask Jonathan if there's anything you would want to add about them, and I'll move the slides back and forward.
Oh, yeah. You know, these are just initial imaginative overlays that are examples of how we might describe to those outside this immediate conversation an overall conceptual approach to bringing habitat to the basin. You know, as a workshopping crew, we need to visually think about how we could bring geomorphic functions into these other land uses. You know, the way we design this project, you know, as Jessica and Anne have described, the way we design this project is going to be based in ecosystem science and, you know, the geomorphological functions of the river, and that's an engineering practice. But graphics like this are really meant to be, are not meant to be definitive, but they are meant to be a loose impression of how we might prioritize and how we can really think of a site-wide system of intervention. So we need to think conceptually about the entire project. And it really just reflects one kind of drawing we might use in our workshop among many others. You know, another thing to think about, you know, when we made these diagrams, we thought about the fact that, you know, there might be some who react to this outside of our group that say, well, you're just blotting out a lot of human function. You're displacing a lot of area as an open space resource to the community. And in reality, we see anything in this footprint as a net positive for Valley residents, because the smaller frequent water interactions within that zone, within that shape on the screen, you know, are geomorphologically, you know, reconnected systems. And, you know, so there's a lot more water interaction, but rather than displacing and blotting out human activity, they would actually add to the opportunity for more passive and more active recreational uses, more education spots, and frankly, it'll enliven the park as a public resource. So imagine in that shape, or the one on the previous slide, you know, new trail types, more access points, more ways of seeing and being in the space. Frankly, those are the areas I want to be in. And it really is going to lead to a more complex park that's more appropriate for a city as complex as Los Angeles. So that's an opportunity area.
Thank you, Jonathan. Want to also sort of tease the mind with some examples of what this could be like. One example is the restored Old Tahunga Wash at Johnny Carson Park. This is a project I was involved in quite a few years ago, and it was finished maybe about 3 years ago, I believe. Kelvin Abe, and now MIG, was the lead on this. Restoration Design Group provided some of the provided the restoration design approach for the watercourse. And this is your classic Southern California dry arroyo that had been in a channel, a surface channel that was lined in asphalt and decorated with rocks. It was made to look like your typical urban fake stream. We took it out, we made it a wild stream again. and integrated it into the park so that it was part of the park system. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. Now, to people who do not love water courses, this may not look terribly beautiful, but to me it is extraordinary. It is what is Los Angeles in many ways. So the habitat is there, the mule fat, the willows, and the function, most importantly, the geomorphic function that's going to maintain that system for as what it is present there. Another example is, and this is controversial because this was put into an alluvial fan. I would like to suggest that thinking about this as an extractive exercise of a golf course rather than an extractive exercise in an alluvial fan, but building the floodplain back into a golf course is a potential approach that can be taken. And by building that floodplain, we're not just talking about letting it flood, but actually bringing back the fingers of habitat that would establish when the geomorphic processes are reestablished, when the river and the floodplain are reconnected and the habitat is allowed to establish and maintain itself in that way. I think that that's what this image does for me, is give us that opportunity to think about how that thought process can apply at the Sepulveda Basin. And so a couple of images up close. You know, of course, being an alluvial fan, you have a lot of alluvial scrub here. You have larger sizes of boulders and rock in the channel than we would probably see at the Sepulveda Basin. So it might look a little different. There might probably be more willow and, again, some of that cottonwood establishing. I would expect mule fat to be there. So this is a little bit different visually and aesthetically, but the principle is, I think, still applicable in this condition. And so you have the greens at slightly higher elevations. They still flood, but not as frequently as what's in these little depressions that are the reconnected floodplain. Also, because golf courses are so dominant on the site, we wanted to also tease your minds with thinking a little differently about the golf courses. You know, there are new approaches coming to golf course management that are being adopted, not just around the world, but also in the United States. This is an example from GHD in Australia, where they are working with the city of Adelaide to reconfigure one of their municipal golf courses to reduce the number of holes. And I don't know the full backstory on why they're doing this, but I would assume that you're creating more room for flooding, for water management, and for habitat. So, you know, as a part of this, they have taken a rather large, you know, basically three 18-hole golf courses and reduced it to one 18-hole golf course and then a suite of smaller golf courses. And this may also work better with the way people are using golf courses these days. So that's also something that could become a selling point to some of the leaseholders at the basin. And also, there is an increased occurrence of shared uses on golf courses. And American Trails published a guidance document talking about how to integrate trails into and around the fairways. And this is also being done elsewhere. I found this wonderful manual by the Scandinavian Turf Grass and Environment Research Foundation. And the sort of slide images you see up top show how in Norway, they're actually really integrating a lot of golf courses with other uses. And in fact, this is often part of a negotiated permit process for golf courses in Norway. And so you see camping, you see bicycling, you see equestrian. I was reading in their document, they talked about how they have deer. They have herds of deer that will then be roaming the golf courses as a part of the facility. So there's some interesting potential with this. And there's also the option of having a golf course be closed one day of the week or during certain hours to let other users onto the golf course to use the facilities. Again, from the Scandinavian Turf Grass and Environment Research Foundation, was a checklist of potential activities that could be integrated into a golf course. And so this is just something to take into the charrette as you're sort of puzzling over how to make the river work within the golf courses, that you may also want to bring in other activity uses to make them more multifunctional. Also, again, so, you know, floodability being the key word of today, there are ways to make other facilities intentionally floodable, recreational facilities, and this is again being kind of spearheaded from Scandinavian countries and from the Netherlands. This example particular being from Denmark. And I want to close with a reflection. You know, I'm not suggesting that we make the Sepulveda Basin Central Park, but I think it's pretty compelling about when you think about the role Central Park plays in New York City. And at some point while I was preparing this presentation, I just wanted to know how big the Sepulveda Basin was in relationship to Central Park. And as you can see, as I put on the slide, Sepulveda Basin is 2.9 square miles, whereas Central Park is only 1.3. In fact, the Sepulveda Basin is the 46th largest park in the United States, and Central Park isn't even in the top 100. Central Park is about 42% of the size of the Sepulveda Basin. And yet, Central Park has 58 miles of trails. And as I told you earlier, I generously mapped walks and trails, and I got about 28 miles. So there is potential to have a more expansive network of circulation for bikes and pedestrians in the basin. And there may be a desire to think about how vehicles travel through the basin as well, and what that does to access, what it does to wildlife corridors. And you may have experience, you may have observed areas where there's always animal strikes or anything like that. That's knowledge that you probably have that no one else will have. And so those are things to think about. I will also notice that, you know, 1,500 plus acres of the Sepulveda Basin are leased to the city of LA. That makes them a major and significant stakeholder in anything that we put forward. And it also suggests that, you know, coordinating any of the changes that we want to make will need to be responsive to the concerns and interests of the city. I don't want that to limit us today. I just want you to be also just thinking from outside of your, you know, your own standpoint and what that means. The other thing that I think is important is that New York City is considered the lungs of, I mean, the Central Park is the lungs of the city. It's been called that for many, many decades. And yesterday when we were discussing this, Jonathan put forward the idea that this is the heart, this is the green heart for the San Fernando Valley, or it could be. And for that green heart, as we move into the charrettes, I'd like you to think about what that green heart is and how it can be a better integrated space. How, if you look at Central Park, there's a flow between spaces. There is an interconnectivity of the human uses and of the woodlands, the water bodies, and the grassy areas that serve over 500 wildlife species, almost 600, that we could probably do better at the Sepulveda Basin. So those are some of the thoughts that I'd like to put out to you. I believe that we are, oh yes, I forgot. I need to talk to you about what we're going to do in the charrette space from the how we work with each other's perspective. This is kind of a playtime, and I hope that we all come into it with an attitude of curiosity and interest and just excitement. I know that when you have been working on a place for many, many years, that it can sometimes become a sense of struggle. And this will definitely be a project that is going to take some time to work out how to move forward all the pieces and bringing it all together with the multiple stakeholder groups that we have. That said, share an idea that sounds impossible. Don't let yourself be limited by what you understand as the current context of political reality. I'd also like you to learn something new about something outside of your area of expertise, getting out of your comfort zone a little bit. Think about designs and policies from perspectives of other interest groups and users. Suggest designs and policies for areas outside of your expertise, even if you're not sure how it would work. If there's something that you just want to explore for the sake of understanding it better, that is what we can do here today. We don't have to have all the answers, but we can try to work things out in our small group formats. Assume good intentions and ask clarifying questions. As we go into the Charrette spaces, we're probably going to ask you to unmute yourself, and we're going to be trying to manage and solicit feedback. And that will be a little challenging because this is Zoom, and it's not, we're not actually physically present together where we have the ability to really take in body language and cues and other information. So let's, as you go into the room, just remember all the basic core, what would you call it, courtesies that we would give to each other, to be generous in our attitudes and in our assumptions about what each other is speaking about and where we're coming from with what we're doing. And bring your authentic self to the conversation. I know a lot of times we wear hats, and those hats kind of dictate positions and approaches and attitudes and beliefs that aren't always completely in alignment with who we are. Today, be who you are. Bring that person forward. And it's okay to not know everything. I certainly don't, none of us do, but the collective mind can be quite brilliant. And I'm hoping that from that perspective, we will all share what we know and be open and receptive to what other people know that we don't. We're going to be split up into 3 groups. Melanie will hit the little Zoom room button. We will all be invited to go to a room. We will spend about 50 minutes in those rooms in Charrette with each other. I will be one of the Charrette facilitators, as will Claire Bowen from SALT LA, as will Jonathan Linkus, also from GHD. And we will have the technical experts, one each in each room. We will have Anna Nazarov, I believe with Jonathan. Yes. And Scott Brown will be with Claire Bowen, and Ann Center will be with me. And we will be, they will be here to help field questions, both of a technical nature and to also kind of help me keep track of what other people are thinking as I'm drawing. And as ditto for Claire and Jonathan. Melanie, is there anything else that you would like to say as we are about to break?
Yeah, I'm going to just really quickly note a few things that came up in the last session, and then I'm going to, while I address those, I want to ask those who haven't to put your affiliation after your Zoom name if you know how to, you can figure out how to do that. So when we're in breakouts, we all know where we're coming from. Joe had asked what GHD stood for. That's Jessica's firm, yes. So a couple of things. Mark was asking if the existing concrete channel design was multi-threaded, and I would say no, but I will allow our balance folks to answer that if they wish.
No, I would say that the design isn't. I mean, there is some threading within the confines, especially in some of the lower areas. But I don't know that was specific to the design, and it's certainly not. It was just kind of a consequence of the hydrology working within the existing concrete areas.
Thanks, Scott. Terry had a couple things. The wider winding picture, she wants to get a map that shows exactly what would be changed if the river was given that. Well, that's what we're going to be working on today in the design process. We haven't made that determination yet. We're wanting to hear from you about what these alternatives are, and that hopefully will come out of, some options will come out of this feasibility study with your expertise brought to the table. Also, carving out 8 feet in that example would remove trees and carbon storage, which would not be her preference. It is, I don't think that we would propose to just wholesale remove 8 feet, as that was more of a, just to give you the math. So we're wanting to be very careful about how we regrade here. And the golf course in Tahunga, of course, took out endangered species. As Jessica mentioned, we all, most of us, and I know you did too, Terry, because I was going through my files recently and looking at a bunch of old letters. on that golf course fight. We all fought that hard. We don't want to see that happening here. Muriel says we don't have much to say about golf courses as a rule, as the Wildlife Area Steering Committee. But I would say that if golf courses can serve for habitat and wildlife, that might change that a bit. And in this design charrette, feel free to consider all these kinds of things. And that Peter Ireland once described the basin as the lungs of the San Fernando Valley. So we can be both lungs and heart. Marianne really appreciated an info about Central Park, getting people off their duffs. And Pat notes that the Central Park Conservancy is continually being enhanced. Central Park is continually being enhanced by the Conservancy there. And so it was a dump until they took it over in the 80s. I can attest to that being there. And I can foresee something like that developing here in Los Angeles. It would be pretty amazing. Clark wants to know if the nearby storm sewer inlets are mapped. Yes. And are there opportunities for dry season flow input and bioinfiltration treatment? Absolutely. Subsurface hydrology. Yes, we do know what's going on here with depths to groundwater and soils.
Melanie, can I jump in and just add, there are some smaller storm drains that we don't have mapped at this time, but we have observed that they exist.
I've got them. Just ask, I've got them. And then Mark was just noting that the Corps had a proposal years ago to remove a lot of soil from the ag area, but doesn't remember the depth of the removal. If anybody here does, let us know. Let us all know. And yes, Pat, we will need continuing maintenance and enforcement for this to succeed. I think, in my vision, and I want you all to bring that visionary mindset to the charrette we're going to break into. Sepulveda Basin can become a much higher profile resource with the river and its tributaries at its center, with more habitat, with more access, with more trails that are connecting to everything. It can become something that attracts that kind of support and stewardship moving forward, in my vision, to succeed. Last note from Jonathan, the net revenue and management cost situation. Yes, Glenn, we do have soils data. I think that each charrette group has that in their toolbox there for you. No? Okay. We do have it.
We have it. We did not put the map in the charrette space.
We didn't. Okay. Glenn, I can share that with you. Net revenue and management cost situation of golf courses may actually improve with a project like ours, creating more sophisticated play experience with less manicured space. A good thing to bring to our charrette sketching. Okay, so if you all have had the chance to put your affiliation after your name in your Zoom name, I'm going to break you out into your Zoom rooms now.
Hey, Melanie, before you do that, since a couple people have also piped up about the soils, what I would just like to point out about the soils very briefly is that there are two dominant soils groups on the site. One of them is not hugely infiltrated or infiltrating, and the other one is moderately infiltrating. And that second soils group is towards the upstream end and the sort of northwest end of the Sepulveda Basin. So, one of the reasons I didn't include it is because there is not a lot of infiltration in the soil type that is there. And if we were thinking about how to increase infiltration in the basin as part of the project, think of the upstream area generally as the area that has the greatest potential to serve that function.
Right. And just as a side note, about a year ago, we were working with JPL on looking at using their phenomenal technology that they're using with LiDAR to map groundwater, land subsidence as a result of groundwater extraction. And they pulled up a shot that they had from a flyover of Sepulveda Basin. And it does show pretty continuous, seasonal significant incidental infiltration to groundwater happening there. So despite the soils not being like Tonga wash sandy, because of the time that the water sits in the basin, it's not just moving through, we're seeing some incidental infiltration. Yes, they're not necessarily, Glenn, I'll give you, we had a great update to our soils map after 100 years from the NRCS, and I'm happy to share the profile with you. and everybody else here if you would like. So are we all ready to move into breakout? Yeah? Take a big,
Let's
take
do
a
it.
big, deep breath, and I'm going to break you out into rooms. See, do we have Jessica? We do. Oh, unmute yourself.
Do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah. I
Uh,
think I know we're running over time, but I think the idea now is for the various breakout rooms to share the ideas. Jessica,
Hey.
go first.
I know Jonathan's gonna have a beautiful drawing that makes mine look like chicken scratch, and so I'm gonna go first and get that humiliation out of the way. So for starters, our group spent a lot of time initially kind of digging into the wildlife area and thinking about how important that space is already and how it's an area that wants to be protected. And so you'll see I have this sort of yellow hatch mark, and that's meant to kind of represent a kind of no-touch zone. We want to protect that as much as possible. Where I put a blue line along the edge of it is there's a potential there to lower the elevations and maybe get a different kind of habitat group in there. And then along the upper portion of Haskell Creek, there is potential to bring a meander into some of this land and still maintain access to the archery grounds. Moving further down Haskell Creek, there are some road crossings where making some improvements to the road crossings themselves would be a benefit to the creek. And the lower wildlife area, that south wildlife area, there's a thought that there are oaks that should be protected, but otherwise this is an area that probably the channel could be widened and more complexity to the creek could be brought into it. Going to the other side, looking at downstream, there was some observations that the agriculture area right here was once used or was slated to be lowered to create more capacity in the dam and create more marshy type habitats. And the Encino Creek could be addressed in tandem with that, where you lower that terrain and you also connect that as a floodplain to Encino Creek, improve the habitat on Encino Creek, implement some trails and things that the city of LA at one point was looking at doing to kind of keep that area more actively used and reduce the homeless encampments there. Going further afield, we were looking at this little triangle of land between, I want to say, Woodley Creek and the LA River. There's some nice habitat in there. And a comment was made that that probably should be preserved if possible. It happens to be right where the LA River is scouring into. And we didn't really talk about how to address that. We're going to have to, I think, puzzle through that a little bit because clearly the LA River is creating a meander there. However, going a little further upstream into Woodley Creek, the observation was made that this is a great opportunity to make the Woodley Lake Golf Course a lot more interesting and exciting. It also dovetails well with an equestrian course to bring the creek through there. Havenhurst Creek, sorry, I have to remember which one I'm talking about. This one, we just wanted to indicate that some meander should be brought back to it. There was a little hesitation about how radical to get with taking any actions with it. But, you know, the intention for some restoration has been expressed. Moving further afield, looking at the LA River from the top, there's a notion that we should be doing some sort of buffer treatment to protect water quality from runoff. There's opportunities to potentially expand the river into some land that may or may not be currently slated for other uses. And as we get below the bus bridge, there is what you see is a tendency for water to backwater behind this bridge. That's part of the flow hydrology. And we have two options. We could replace the bridge, make it higher, create more capacity underneath it, make it free spanning. We could also create a causeway or secondary path for water to flow down. That could be bringing flood flows and higher frequency, lower frequency flows into the golf course and reestablishing some of that floodplain habitat through the two golf courses. It was also suggested that we do both and really make this a statement for the river, that the infrastructure that we have on the river really supports river function. final comments is that in general, land uses should probably ring the outer edges where you are less likely to have flood flows. So infrastructure and some of the more intensive human uses could be rethought and reorganized around the outer perimeter, and that we would have a really robust network of trails and access coming down through and into the heart, that green heart of the park. So that is our concept. And I want to thank all the members of Team 1 and Room 1 for doing that project. I'm gonna hand it over to
I think we should go in order, because again, I haven't seen Jonathan's, but again, I don't need to be embarrassed because we got started late, Room 2 did. So we did a lot of kind of talking beforehand before we actually had access to the screen. So and we spent a lot of time talking at the beginning, but I think there's a lot of great ideas. So are you going to just keep sharing, or are you going to stop sharing and I'm going to share, or just?
I can do, if it's not too much of a pain in the butt, I can certainly navigate for you while you're
so
talking.
if you don't mind just pushing up just a little bit, I want to just start a little bit with some of the notes we made back up to the post-its, and maybe just first sharing that we actually had a number of ideas for our team name. Everything from full access to least bells vario, and I think it just kind of really speaks to some of the major themes that we then heard as we started talking. There was a lot of interest in terms of really making the Sepulveda Basin itself kind of much more accessible, kind of like Central Park is described, where you can really kind of get to it from all places. Right now, so much of the basin is kind of, hidden. And then obviously really a lot of focus too on, again, the habitat value that can be improved, and also sometimes just increasing people's awareness of the value of the habitat that's there, and especially how it supports the bird species, especially those who are using this area as a migratory place. So, and I did want to point out, we had a comment about just obviously making sure that as we think about all these new changes that might be brought in here, that we're still mindful of the issue of concerns and issues of homelessness, which obviously continue to be a problem or a concern everywhere in the city. So if you want to move, I think I got most of it, again, a lot about restoration and access. So those are kind of the main concern areas. If people mentioned concern about, and I want to make sure we don't lose habitat as we widen, out. So if you want to kind of maybe center us now back down on the.
I just need to lock. I just moved your board.
No, and I did the same thing. I had to kind of move myself back down because I had getting all those tools. So again, we did a little less drawing than you did, but we started actually focusing initially on Haskell Creek, because I think, as you've mentioned, there was a lot of interest, obviously, and we talked about already protecting the wilderness area, but maybe there's ways now to kind of extend additional threads, out into kind of the west, and then looking at maybe ways of connecting underneath, Burbank Boulevard, and getting some things open here. I think, again, when I slid this little kind of wetland area, marsh area, wasn't meant to be on Burbank Boulevard, but really kind of just down below it, this little kind of blue kind of circle. And then there was also interest in further kind of restoring and protecting these two kind of green areas, just areas for improved, kind of habitat and wildlife areas. We then really turned our attention to the LA River itself. And we initially were a little bit more kind of tentative, like, well, let's just, maybe add a thread in, but concerned about making sure we kept the paths that were there. So maybe you have a path that is still down in part of the low flow areas, but maybe then there's a higher path, but then also creating bicycle paths that kind of wander through. So they're not just these kind of perimeter pathways. So really the pink and green are kind of a variety of multi-purpose paths, maybe at different levels, again, some lower down. And then we started to get a little bit more kind of expansive and started to think, well, maybe there are some fingers of the river that, again, more a multi-threaded idea that start to wind through the golf course. You start to really think about redesigning the golf course to bring in more habitat, but still allowing, obviously, for the golf activities to continue. And then we started to think a little bit about doing the same idea with Woodley. We mostly were focused on kind of the Havenhurst, but we certainly could probably do something, what you were describing, also taking the Woodley creek and it's starting to bring it through. But again, the idea of keeping the golf course, and then obviously extending some a path, kind of north. Brian was mentioning that, this area kind of where the stream kind of does this big bump right down there at the bottom of the Woodley Lake Golf Course is where that kind of Grand Canyon is. So that really is an area where you really would want to see it widened out, because clearly the river is really wanting to carve pretty aggressively in that area. So really a lot of value for widening in that area. And then, wanting to maybe then just kind of the most westernmost area, because there is this kind of triangular area where, again, there isn't a lot of activity, that again, that's another place to kind of widen. And again, we didn't go into the recreation, that's just my map slipping. So I think those were the major areas. We didn't do as much drawing as you did, but I think we got a lot of great ideas down.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's move over to room 3, team 3. We're the Scrub Jays.
Yes. Okay, so maybe we can move a little bit into our post-it notes at the top. Scrub jays, and another major theme in addition to habitat was homeless and their concerns. And a lot of the same areas were identified, obviously, with the other groups. Those ruderal triangles, as we call them, between the tributaries and main LA River were identified. And we also had a special focus on what's called the back 40. Jessica, that's where those homeless encampments are, next to the Balboa Sports Complex and the triangle of land, catty corner to it across the river. And we too, we're looking at the golf courses as a really a way to design a more sophisticated environment. And so some of the protection conversation and, where do we prioritize how we interact with existing uses that need to be protected, moved, or considered. A lot of informal but large and impactful uses of Woodley Park and the amphitheater and green space north of the North Wildlife Area create a big parking footprint that's informal. One of those is a swap meet that's, I don't know if it's even permitted, but it shows up on a regular basis at the Woodley Park. And there's also large parties and events that occur near the archery area, and those bring perhaps tens to hundreds of cars that are parking, where they may. And in general, we shared with each other the sense that parking is a kind of, you're on your own, and so it's not an organized parking and transportation system. So we began to discuss the value of the Orange Line and also the value of transit as a way of possibly creating more of a park and walk or park and connect strategy using I brought up a loop circulator bus or bus stations that might be inside of the park as a way of rolling back some of those large asphalt areas. Parking magazines and parking structures were mentioned, and all of this would make sense if the Olympics come to this site, that those solutions could go hand in hand. The concerns around the needs and impact of houseless residents of the basin was brought up a lot in our group, and that's really important because they too are a kind of fauna that have habitat needs and have habitat choices they are making based around their criteria, such as the need for security, shade, and there's almost a sort of real estate valuation of land and proximity for them too. And so if this project were to sort of have a rubber hits the road moment, we would probably want to bring in a sociology consultant or people who interact more frequently and engage with that community to understand what are their needs and preferences. Just because we designate or identify an area where the homeless should go or should be repositioned in a new kind of housing, or we might place new services, that doesn't really get around the fact that they're out there locating themselves based on their proximities and their home ranges to affordable food and restaurants, a walking distance to the resources the city has placed in the neighborhood, and roads and river areas that have better views, better shade, lower fire risk, and also security risk, because violence within that community is a concern as well. And because of that, they are going to find their own areas, and that needs to be mapped as a kind of its own ecosystem, its own habitat area, and it will have its own tributaries that connect those different areas. So it might even be a layer in our mapping that we consider going forward. A really interesting idea that was mentioned was that the whole of Sepulveda Basin could be perhaps a new resource for mitigation areas in carbon offset plantings and tree plantings and carbon forestry. And those areas are dwindling over the years around Southern California, and with development pressures in urban Southern California, places like this are a great place to do that and bring a multi-benefit to the park. In terms of the sketching we've done, we identified basically everything that was listed on those first thoughts: the triangles, the creeks, a lot of interest around the braids, and the braid, excuse me, not braid, but the multi-channel solutions through the South Encino Golf Course and Balboa Golf Course. And we talked about let's do that up to the driving range. Some really interesting points that we talked about was, if the model airplane field is renaturalized, is there a fire risk, and should there be a fire buffer or defensible space around the landing area if it's not moved, because those model airplanes can create a fire risk. But where that does happen in the model airplane prism or geometry, if you will, that orange arrow indicates the need for a species bridging or tunneling or crossing below the street there. And that might also make a lot of sense for people who are visiting and using trails through the area. Just so, and as we saw in the last sketching exercise, the last two, multi-channel connections and trail connections between the North Wildlife Area and the South Wildlife Area are constrained by the road right now. And so, does that need to be something wider, like a viaduct or a broad array of box culverts? Is there some civil engineering solution to broaden that connection to more than just, a tube? And how do we make that, really come to life across there, so that the road is above and not in the way of nature and people? I'm going to stop there. There's a lot of thoughts we all laid down, and it sounds like this mural exercise has done a lot to document everyone's thoughts geographically, and also our note taking is very rich. So I'm excited to collate that.
Thank you. Sounds like we've got some really great feedback over 3 groups, and we'll be taking this information forward and, as Jonathan said, collating it and looking at a couple of alternatives that could be developed for the Sepulveda Basin for our feasibility study report. Melanie, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate how many of you stuck around for the extra half hour on a Saturday. All of us are so grateful for your expertise and your ideas, and it's been extraordinarily helpful. Nobody knows this area as much as many of these wildlife area steering committee members do. So I'm really thankful for your input. And Clark wants to know, it's called Mural, M-U-R-A-L. This was the mural tool. And I thank the designers and the engineers for collaborating and working with you all to make these lovely sketches. We will continue to move forward, and we'll stay in touch and keep collaborating through the Wildlife Area Steering Committee and other avenues. And we will check back with you once we start to turn these sketches into something a little more cohesive. I think all of our hopes and dreams, all of our hopes here really do hinge on an integrated planning approach for Sepulveda Basin. There are going to be significant investments here over what is really a very short period of time, the next 7 years, 6.5. And there's opportunities for investments. There's opportunities for real good collaboration Of course, our perspective is that the river really, and the geomorphic functions of the river and its tributaries should drive design decisions here, because as we see it, that can realize the greatest number of benefits for humans, for wildlife, for biodiversity, for public safety, and climate change resilience. So we hope that we can gather a group and move forward together collaboratively, designing this integrated approach from the river outward, and using science to guide our future here. It's an opportunity that the committee hasn't seen in its 30 years, with the potential for investment here. And there's certainly potential for things to go sideways, but I know that you all are dedicated, and as we work together and with the partnerships that we're establishing, I think there's reason for optimism. So we look forward to many more conversations about this. Does anybody have any questions before we let you go back to your weekend? Thank you, Clark. Yes. Yes, wildfire
when will we
interface.
reconvene?
Pardon?
I was just asking, when will we reconvene? Thanks, Melanie.
That would be a conversation that you and I and Brian would have, I think. But we will be continuing to participate in the Wildlife Area Steering Committee meetings every month and updating you as we're moving through. Anybody else?
Just thank you. It was great.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you all. Much appreciated, and sorry for my technological glitch on that bit, but I'll get better. And thank you, Sarah, for your help. All right, you all have a great weekend.
Great, thanks.
See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.